Our next session is Trustworthy AI, Charting the Path for Responsible Adoption. Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
I don't think we're allowed to do that.
We're just doing what we're told.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Andrew Straits. I'm an Associate Director at the Ada Lovelace Institute, a nonprofit institute based here in London. Very excited to talk with you today and our wonderful panelists about Trustworthy AI. It's safe to say from many of the panels you've heard today that we're in a very strange and extraordinary time. Companies in almost every sector are seeking to rapidly deploy AI technologies to analyze data, generate content, make predictions, and to augment, or in some cases replace, human decision-making. Oftentimes this is done while trying to navigate many of the variety of risks these technologies raise, from data protection, transparency, accountability, loss of control issues, all coming up at once. In conversations about trustworthy AI, it's often talked about as a clear destination, a checkbox that we can reach once we've implemented the right frameworks and best practices. But trust isn't a technical solution that we can engineer together. It's rather a relationship between people and institutions built through consistent demonstration of competence, transparency, and accountability. So as companies explore strategies for responsible AI, it's important that we move beyond surface-level compliance and ask much more deeper questions. Questions like, what does meaningful accountability look like in practice? How do we balance innovation with prudence? And most importantly, how do we ensure that our pursuit of trustworthy AI doesn't become a hollow marketing exercise and rather drives genuine organizational change? I'm excited to explore these questions with our distinguished panelists who bring diverse perspectives from their work on the front lines of AI implementation. Diana Zamora-Bonnet, who's our Director of Public Policy at MasterCard. Irakli Kodeli, who's the Head of Ethics of AI Unit at UNESCO. Andrew Pakes, the MP for Member of Parliament for, MP for Peterborough, quite too many P's there, gosh. And Professor Wendy Hui Kong-Chan at Simon Fraser University and Chair of the Panel of Global Standards for AI Audits. Thank you so much for joining us. Diana, I'd love to start with you. You've previously worked in the public sector in Mexico, Colombia, and the city of New York, and now lead MasterCard's public policy team. As a global technology company in the payments sector, how does MasterCard balance innovation in AI with maintaining trust and compliance across different regulatory environments?
First, thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here. This conference has blew my mind. So first, I want to make you think about the last thing that you bought. You probably were not excited about bringing that piece of plastic out. You were thinking about that coffee that you're going to be buying. You were thinking about that dress that you liked in that online shop. Last year, 143 billion transactions were trusted to run on MasterCard's system. And this happened across more than 200 countries in different currencies. And this happens instantly. So it's very difficult, and it requires a lot of innovation to balance these two things out. To be quick, efficient, seamless, but at the same time, safe, secure, protected. And approximately 95% of card-related fraud happens online. So let's say if you lose the piece of plastic, the likelihood of that being used for fraud is super low in what we call it card-present transaction. However, in the online world, it's harder to know that you are the person that is trying to make that transaction and that you are you. So in order to do that, we need to do these two balances. If we were to approve all of the transactions, then all of the fraud would come in. And if we didn't allow any of those transactions, then the system didn't work. So what we're trying always to do at MasterCard is to innovate, and we're using AI in that sense. So we're using AI to prevent fraud, to prevent cybersecurity attacks. We're building tools that will allow banks, financial institutions, to know their customers much better, to prevent money laundering. This technology is going to be used, is already being used in bad ways, and we know that we need to get ahead of that. And finally, I would like to stress to think about this data. We have a commitment to the data that we collect from our clients. So first, you own your data. So the data is always yours. Second, you control your data. You have the right to understand how we use that data and how you can and how you want to use it. The third one is that you should benefit from it. The examples that I was giving before, when you're shopping online, you probably received an SMS or your banking app prompted you to do an additional verification. So it's your data. Your life should be easier by using that data. And finally, we protect it. So that's how we're trying to balance all these gazillions of transactions across the world.
Oh gosh, so quite out there. I love the focus on kind of how is it working in the consumer's interest, that sort of public benefit question. Irakli, I want to turn to you now. You're working at the international level at UNESCO with global governments, major corporations to develop standards and an ethical framework for AI. How are you thinking about trust and trustworthiness at this international level?
Sure, thank you very much, Andrew, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference. It's a great honor, pleasure to be here, especially to be witnessing the situation where we can now announce the tool that we've been working together with the Thomson Reuters Foundation for some time. This is a really exciting moment for us. The fundamental question that underlies our discussion about trustworthiness and trust is really, what do we want AI to do for us? And I believe that we all know the answer to that question. We want AI to work for the benefit, for the good of each and every one of us here individually, our societies, humanity writ large, and the planet. And that's where trustworthiness, trust comes in, because it's an essential component for us to reach that aim throughout the life cycle of AI systems, trustworthiness in AI systems throughout their life cycle. And what's really, when you're talking about the concepts of trust and trustworthiness, or the aims at the global level, it is fundamentally important to think of this as a very expansive concept that includes in it not only the concepts that come immediately to mind when we're talking about trust, such as the concepts that were already mentioned, safety, privacy, security. These are the things that, accountability. I mean, it is obvious that the ability to monitor the life cycle of AI systems is at the heart of trusting that system. And so the accountability, meaningful accountability, as you have pointed out, is fundamental. But we really also, if the trustworthiness is the compass that we're using to guide AI systems that we want for ourselves in the future, then we have to encompass in that conversation things like fairness and non-discrimination, concepts, the ideas of ethical alignment, that the AI systems that we are dealing with are aligned with the fundamental values that we hold dear as humanity. And such issues as inclusiveness, for instance, that everybody has had a chance to contribute to the discussion about the AI and its benefits. So that's what makes us really excited about the tool, the AI Governance Disclosure Initiative, because it mimics the comprehensive nature of the recommendation on ethics of AI that was mentioned in the video, that represents currently the only global normative framework that exists and that guides us in the development of AI. And this disclosure initiative basically offers to the private sector, to the companies, a way to align themselves with this globally agreed upon framework and disclose and demonstrate how they are building trust and trustworthy AI systems within those companies.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, the tools looks fantastic, and I'm really excited to see how we can think about the role of disclosure and what else is needed to support it when we talk about meaningful change. But Andrew, I want to come to you next. You've had an incredible background in education, in labor organizing, and now in politics. From a public sector perspective, I'm curious how partnerships from the private sector, with the private sector, might help prepare for the rapid adoption of AI technologies while ensuring they're responsibly used and ensuring that they protect citizens' rights. I'm aware this is something you've worked quite closely on for many years now.
And I think that's one of the critical questions to me. I think it's a pleasure to be here at the launch of this new disclosure project, because I think it's so important getting to it. And I find a great privilege being a legislator at this particular juncture where technology is transforming our lives so quickly, given my background in labor organizing, in community activism, and in AI policy, to now be at that juncture where legislators are now having to make decisions about this, and tools like the Disclosure Project really help us do that. But look, step back from it, the big picture to me about how do we have cohesive, equal, better informed societies. Trust, I think, is one of the big issues facing us across all spheres. In many parts of the world, there is a disjuncture of populism against the age of information. All the known things I had growing up about expertise, about evidence, about science, about informing decisions is being challenged in many societies where we have an extremism coming across from left or right, breaking down some of the norms. And so to me, any solutions or practices that come through have to begin to address that idea of trust. There's a brilliant phrase I came across many years ago, I think from the US disabled rights movement, maybe the British, nothing about us without us. And I think that's the change, that when we live in a moment of huge industrial, economic and political change in the world, where insecurity is taken over, if people feel that change is being done to them, then we risk losing out some of these amazing benefits, because that concept of trust and how people do. So I tend to look at these things in three concepts, 3 Ps around people, power and place. And I think the Disclosure Project will really help get us into some of that space. That whenever we're looking at AI, at new technology, how it impacts the world of work society, we really need to understand its impact on people. And there needs to be some sense of accountability. And actually, I dislike some of this conversation that talks about accountable AI, because actually the AI doesn't need to be accountable. The businesses and organizations that deploy the technology need to be accountable. And we need to locate it in humanity, human decision-making process, industrial processes, the accountability of the people. The technology just follows the use it's put to. So firstly about people. Secondly about power. Who's in the room where decisions are made? And we know that in previous periods of economic change, traditionally it's been marginalized groups, it's been workers, it's been women, it's been different ethnic groups who have been outside of the room where decisions are made. If we want to get the full benefits of this technology, we know what we've missed in the past. How do we get people in there so there is power and conversation and dialogue through disclosure about how we get to that? And secondly, it's about place. The beauty and wonder of this technology is that it can be done almost anywhere, but it has to be done somewhere. And if we end up in a space where innovation is about extending inequalities between the global south and the global north, it's about transferring power across nations or within nations. In a constituency, a community I represent, if AI means jobs are replaced, jobs are automated out of existence but not replaced, I can tell you the place I represent will feel AI is not a trustworthy thing. So how do we learn the lessons of history? This is not the first industrial revolution we've had, though I feel it may have characteristics where it is faster, more intense, and quicker than any other form of industrial change. But we have a history of insight of how we've got these things wrong, and we have an opportunity to get it right. And they're the kind of things that sit in my thing. So that partnership approach.
I really like that point about accountability in particular, this idea of what meaningful accountability looks like. Wendy, you wear many hats, but one of them is being the chair of the scientific panel on global standards for AI auditing. You've written about this concept of trustworthy audits, which is sort of a tool or mechanism for how we can try to assess systems for various kinds of risks and ideally enable accountability. I was curious if you could just explain a bit about what trustworthy audits are and how we can ensure these audits are effective for countries across different cultural and regulatory contexts.
Right. Well, thank you for this important question, and hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking about two nerdy things that I want you to get very excited about, which is science and audits. Okay. I'm going to do this because based on the conversation both yesterday and today, it's clear that none of us want to engage in compliance theater, right? No one wants to put a lot of time and money in audits that foster distrust rather than trust. So I've been working with a group of experts, interdisciplinary experts from computer science to legal experts, global experts, to take on this question, focusing in particular on the global impacts of AI. And at a basic level, the answer is simple. Trustworthy audits are scientific, right? So yesterday, a lot of people talked about the Edelman Trust Barometer, and a lot of people were horrified, excited, dismayed at the fact that businesses were trusted more than journalists and politicians, right? But what we didn't mention is the group that's most trusted. Any guesses as to the group that's most trusted? Scientists, yes. Scientists come in at 74%, which is also people like me. Literally, the category people like me and scientists are both 74%. And businesses were at 68%. So what makes science trustworthy? Well, as Naomi Oreskes has revealed in her book, Why Trust Science, and if you're not familiar with Oreskes' work, I highly recommend it, and that book in particular, she argues that science is trustworthy when it's, one, empirical, so engages with reality, with facts, with things that matter, and two, because it's social. It's never just one scientist, it's a community of experts. It needs to be open and fluid and also self-critical. This is why science changes. So in terms of trustworthy audits have to engage in reality. So there needs to be real access to documentation, to data, to models. And secondly, it has to be embedded within a trustworthy ecosystem. Right? So no one audit or audit type is trustworthy in and of itself. Right? So we need a wide variety of audits, from compliance audits, from businesses, as well as audit firms, as well as more investigatory audits by journalists, by academics, and by civil society. And I would want to emphasize the importance of these investigatory audits. So imagine what we wouldn't know about global climate change if we had only relied on corporations to audit themselves, oil companies to audit themselves, right? So we need to have a complementary relationship between these types of audits, not a competitive one.
I really like that. It's touching on, I think, a fundamental question about accountability here. How do we enable access, in some cases, for investigatory journalists or for other actors in this ecosystem to assess and evaluate these systems? What kind of mechanisms need to be put in place? But also, crucially, how do you ensure that companies are acting on those findings, that they are actually being held accountable? I think this term, as you rightly pointed out, Andrew, is very poorly defined in some cases. We talk about accountable AI, not so much accountable organization. So I'm curious, if I could just open it up to the entire panel, what practical steps might companies take to increase accountability over the technologies that they are deploying at mass scale? Please.
So at MasterCard, we've worked with some shape of machine learning, statistics, AI for about 15 years now. And that has to do with the amount of data that we manage. So we have a two-tiered approach. First, we have a board, an AI overseeing board, and it's a multidisciplinary board. We want to make sure that everybody is represented in that board, so we have legal people, policy people, product people, business people. And after that board approves that new product or strategy or service is okay, then it undertakes a deeply technical analysis. And again, within that technical, there are different pockets of that technicality that come into place. And there are other two things that we look into scaling, right? So first, is there return on investment? Otherwise, we're wasting our time. Number two, is there scale? If there's no scale, why are we engaging in this? We have scarce resources, and we need to solve this safely and fast. And finally, how do you implement this in a very specific way? So we have a set of principles. The first one I already mentioned, it's about privacy. Everything that we do has privacy by design. We don't design anything randomly. Privacy and security is first and foremost. Some of our business colleagues sometimes don't like our lawyers and our privacy team. But that's the way it works at MasterCard. Number two, there is transparency. So our clients need to understand in a very simple way, in a very simple manner, what's going in and what's going out, and what the AI solution is rendering the results we're aiming at. We also have a very robust system on accountability, on putting some locks within different parts of loops where we identify in a risk-based basis. We also abide by a fairness principle. So we have the intention at the forefront of minimizing bias and doing no harm. We also are both within our own organization and with the services that we're trying to build, we want to be inclusive. So again, we want to bring different parts of the business and different verticals to be sure that all voices are included and that those products can serve in a very inclusive way. And also, we're committed into innovation, but what does that mean? If there's another solution out there that is much better, why bother? And finally, just for social good, we always say that we are a data-driven company, and we can leverage the data for social good. So those are very specific examples on how we have done this for the past 15 years.
I really like that. I suppose one challenge I'm seeing right now with responsible AI or trustworthy AI that is kind of happening at the moment is this kind of surge of general purpose, quote unquote, AI systems. Who here is using Microsoft Teams, God help us, and suddenly finds that Copilot is everywhere in our tools all of a sudden. There's a really interesting challenge here, I think, in which we're seeing kind of large providers sort of pushing very powerful AI systems into our workplaces, into our institutions, but without much sort of training or a sense of awareness of how to use these tools. It seems to be kind of being pushed downstream onto every business or every local institution. I'm curious, how do we grapple with that? You know, where should responsibility lie when it comes to these types of more powerful systems that are being pushed out? And how do businesses try to deal with that kind of challenge? I don't know if anyone has a particular interest in this. Irakli, I'm curious for your views on this.
Yes, well, just to quickly touch upon the point of the accountability, because I think that was very important. For us, and now that we've announced this tool, I think that one important measure indicating companies' willingness for accountability would be participation in this initiative, and we would really like to see a lot of companies participate in it. I think that, I mean, the approach that we have at UNESCO, of course, our sort of number one interlocutors are the governments that make up our governing bodies. We're the membership organization of 194 member states. But what makes this recommendation on ethics of AI really unique, amongst other things, is that it's also really geared towards the private sector. And so we have been systematically engaging with the private sector on this front, establishing the business council, and now offering and getting their feedback on this tool. So this tool is not something that we're developing in the closed room without civil society, very importantly, and the business community is involved and has been giving us a lot of feedback. So we feel like these businesses will be already ready to take on this initiative, and we believe that accountability will be greatly served by participating in this comprehensive exercise. And just to also note that the redressal mechanisms when it comes down to accountability are also very, very important. Because inevitably things go wrong, there are mistakes made, there are people that are impacted negatively by AI systems, and they should always have a way to redress the harm done. So for us at UNESCO, that is a very important sort of criteria.
I imagine redress is a common issue as well in the public sector. Andrew, I don't know if you have any thoughts on sort of this kind of question about accountability and redress and where responsibility ultimately lies with who's deploying.
Yeah, I in some ways have a real dilemma, which is my preference, and I say this as a legislator, is that I often think legislation can stifle innovation and hold things back. But the reason we're grappling for some of this is because there are unintended consequences, there are bad faith actors, things are happening out there that we need rules. And actually one of the things that will take pressure off governments to legislate will be business and communities getting together, which I think this new initiative plays into it. But there are real world impacts, and I think when we talk about AI and technology, it's about understanding what we mean. AI, which could help cure a relative or identify a relative's propensity to cancer or identify an illness earlier, I think we can see a clear purpose for it. The end, what my experience tends to be in, is what you could call people analytics, the use of technology to manage people and to make things more efficient. I think accountability is very different there. So you talk about this week's suite of things about co-pilots helping us, but the conversation often is things like call centers and others. Wouldn't it be great to have AI? Because as a consumer or a citizen, my problem will be identified quicker. I will get to the point where I need help quicker. And that's where the conversation stops, and we sell it as a great thing for humanity. What we don't do is what's behind the net curtain, the next bit, which is, well, if AI can do that, what about all the people working in call centers, and how will they feel at the end of it? So accountability, to me, has to be multidisciplinary. We actually need the economists, we need the human resources, we need the people in the room as well as technology to understand it, because that's why it will break trust. If people feel economic change is going to do bad things to them, then actually distrust will continue. And I think sometimes we over-romanticize AI is so novel, when actually the framework I often adopt is one around risks and harms, and we know about that. We know if I work in an industrial plant and I am scolded by boiling hot water, we know the employer is responsible. If I'm in a community and they've only employed people who don't look like me, I can spot a pattern. So in the traditional economy, we know what inequality looks like. We know what bad outcomes look like. When a company only employs men and not women, we can spot that by seeing it. And consequence, if an algorithm does that, only recruits the like, we know when we actually know what that looks like in the old economy. So how do we apply traditional norms of accountability in this new world? And one of our challenges is it can happen in the ether. We can't see the process for it. But essentially, if a harm is done to someone, who is accountable? And that's why I think we need to stop talking about it being the technology and talk about it being the entity that does it. That health and safety risk approach to risk and harm, I think, is much more powerful. And when we get into that, we will then reduce the need for legislation, because there's already ways to do this.
Yeah, so I think that point about norm building is really, really important. And Wendy, I want to kind of pick up on something you're talking about regarding audits. One of the challenges around norms, I think we've seen in other sectors with audits, has been this revolving door that you see between sort of public and private sector organizations, and the challenges that can raise for the sort of sustainability and trust in what we're trying to do here. I'm curious if you have thoughts on how we could try to nip that in the bud when we talk about the sort of emerging AI audit space and around some of the other accountability practices that we've been discussing.
Yeah, so we'll be publishing very soon a global protocol on AI auditing, which will directly address those issues in terms of what needs to be considered, criteria, who, et cetera. But I also wanted to pick up on a couple of things that have been said. One is I couldn't agree more about the unease at times around government regulation. So I come from Canada. Canada is often considered this kind of banal and nice country. we're all kind of vaguely on the side of good. At least outsiders think this. Okay, but during the last conservative government scientists were not allowed to talk to journalists unless they went through a central media organization. And then these requests were often denied, or they were okayed if the government official was also on the line. And at times, the government officials actually wrote up answers in the name of these scientists. So I think we need to think through this larger stakeholder map. So civil society is crucial. We need to, as well, as you've pointed out, and as the voluntary regulation points out, think through the entire life cycle of AI, electricity, but also cleaning of data in the global majority countries when we think through this. So we need to fully cost out and have a way to cost out these systems. And ask, are they really doing what they say they're doing? Are they really saving money? And this is where auditing actually works.
Yeah, I really want to follow up on this point about the climate impacts. Many of the questions we're getting from the audience are kind of around this question of the carbon and energy and water impact of AI systems, and how can we have a responsible AI conversation without including those aspects in? I'm curious, Diana, as an organization that's trying to use a lot of AI systems, is this something that is kind of being baked into your approach for how you're thinking of responsible adoption of these technologies?
I mean, I want to update some pieces that have already been said and reiterate that we're in a trust business. If we lose the trust of the card holders of MasterCards outside, or we lose the trust of merchants having receiving payments from a MasterCard, our business will not work. So that is very aligned. So we are a business. It's very aligned to what we do, and we have incentives to do that. And on the other part, the challenge out there on many other instances where AI is being used, deployed, leveraged, we need a lot of minds, and we need all of the sectors to think through. It's not only about the engineers, it's not only about the technology. I mean, this panel is a testament on that, right? We have multilaterals, we have the government, we have academics. So, and we are very aware of how that stakeholder mapping is key, and get it from the onset, right? And within the organization, that is also extremely important. And I'm gonna say something that is very basic. So when we started implementing our own employee policy on how to interact with AI systems, we just opened spaces to chat, because after the pandemic, we haven't come back fully to the office, and we just opened virtual spaces for engineers, for legal people, just to chat, because that's super human. And it might sound very obvious or, I don't know, not very smart, but it's just there. As soon as we lose those pieces of the conversation, then we lose the possibility of mitigating bias and minimizing harm and maximizing the potential benefit.
Yeah.
Do you want to come in this, Andrew, as well? This question of the kind of way to think through the sort of relationship between trust and sort of downstream users.
Yeah, I think those are really important points of how we do that. And I think there's a tendency, because of the amazing power of technology and innovation, we end up being very upstream, thinking about how we deal with trust through the innovation, the technology itself, the superheroes of the big tech world who are vital to this. What we often miss is the downstream argument, which is, I suppose, what I'd call everyday AI, which is how do all of us who are non-experts engage with this? Because that's where the trust conversation comes from. I think auditing is critical, and you need specialists to do that, but it needs to then be part of a conversation, almost a kite mark, so the rest of us feel that we are part of that conversation. And that's where, to me, that's the big risk, which is if we don't build that trust, as humanity, we will fail to generate the real benefits this technology has to the public good, because it will be a them and us, between different parts of the world, different communities, different outcomes for us. And that's why I think it's critical that we have that conversation about everyday AI. So the rest of us in communities, in workforces, understand where it fits in, are comfortable and confident with technological change, and we build a level of security through different welfare systems, government systems, partnerships, so people can adapt to change. Because we live in a world where change for most people is a bad thing. We love it in tech world because we get to see all the benefits of it. And if we're honest, most of in this room have an economic privilege that we can weather and adapt to change. And most of the decision makers have a privileged position of wealth and others that we can adapt to change. But in everyday AI world, it means poorer outcomes, less jobs, decisions where you're not sure how that decision is reached, or a feeling you're being left behind. And we cannot have a decade where we're building a model where people feel left out or left behind, because that way lies madness in terms of global insecurity.
I want to move the conversation to regulation, because I think this is something that many businesses and organizations are dealing with now at an international level. We're seeing regulation passed in China, in Europe around AI. We have a bill coming out here in the UK very shortly around this. We're seeing state-level bills pop up over the US, and many other international bills pop over in South America, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa. I'm curious, as we start to get into a world where AI regulation is becoming more and more present, how do we try to navigate this challenge of interoperability of these different regulations and statutes? Wendy, I'm sure that you're dealing with this quite a lot at the international level in the panel you're dealing with. Would you like to share a bit more about how you're thinking about this?
Yeah, no, interoperability is a huge issue, especially, and I know that your organization looked at, so audits are used for New York Local Law 144, which looks at bias in hiring. And one difficulty with that is, what do you do when a company, for instance, is based outside of the United States? What kind of access do you have to data and documentation? And I think this question of researcher access or auditor access to data and documentation is something that's that has to be worked on at an interregional level, as well as, again, thinking through the full life cycle of AI, not thinking simply about hiring or labor impacts only at the level of the 4/5 rule of hiring within the United States, but the impact, again, on folks in the global majority countries who are doing a lot of the data cleaning, et cetera, thinking through electricity. So I think that thinking through interoperability is important, and not simply at the level of this law and this law, but trying to figure out what are the main components, and how can we think at that level, like criteria, auditor, methodology, et cetera, in order to make these audits meaningful.
Yeah, interesting. Rackley, yeah.
Yes, just a really quick comment about this idea of regulation that is, of course, fundamentally important. But considering that we're really talking about the revolutionary technology that holds unprecedented promise for us to achieve the socio-economic goals that we've set ourselves as a humanity, it's important to understand that regulation is part of this governance conversation that we're having about AI. And it's not only about regulating the which we obviously need to do, but it's also, we need to talk about the type of incentives that we'll be creating to promote the type of public interest AI that we have mentioned, for instance, for the medical application in the medical field, but also in agriculture and weather forecasting and all kinds of different other areas. For us at UNESCO, it's really important to look at the regulation as part of the overall set of tools of statecraft that also include giving financial incentives or some other type of incentives that promote the good type of AI.
Yeah, so I think a very good point there about sort of industrial strategy and other kinds of tools beyond regulation.
Strategy, trades, rules and data flows across borders, etc.
Dan, I know. Oh, sorry. Please.
I think there's a real mindset challenge, particularly in this global space where lots of challenge thing is: do we think of regulation as a journey, or do we think of regulation as a destination? And I think to me that's a real philosophically important point, because if it's about a destination, then we can end up with different countries, different bodies setting very prescriptive forms of regulation which then don't interact with each other. To me, regulation is a journey. It should be about values, it should be about principles, it should be about processes that involve people, and not about regulating products.
Yeah.
And that's the danger we end up. We end up with 7 different international standards competing in global blocks. And again, we all fail on that. And I think, how do we convene this in? Good regulation is an enduring set of principles and values which can adapt as the technology adapts. And I think we sometimes get those two things confused.
Now, Diana, I imagine you're dealing with this firsthand, being deployed in many hundreds of countries.
3 quick things. 1, let's leverage the regulations that we already have in place. Let's not make up a new law, which is much easier to leverage. That happens in some markets. In some other markets, then we need some data protection laws, and over that, probably a tune-in for AI. Number 2, let's not be prescriptive. In the financial sector, we regulate the same a bank if the bank allows you to enter through an app, if it allows you to enter through the internet. Let's not regulate the technology in itself, but the risk that it entails for the system and for people. And number 3, this concept of regulatory interoperability is where the efforts that, for example, UNESCO is leading. It's super important. We're a global company. We are interoperable by design. So my Mexican card works here in London. It's interoperable. So regulation needs to have some core principles that allow our legal teams, our product teams, to connect easily and to pick up as many of the global south markets that are out there and that could benefit from the technology.
So I want to ask quickly, in the final 4 minutes we have, if you were to give advice to regulators or policymakers, I should say, who are designing AI regulation right now in different parts of the world, what would you say to them? And Andrea might give you a reprieve from this question so you don't have any challenges. Wendy, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'd like to add, because so much has already been said on this, right? You don't do specific technologies. That's a way to make sure that it won't age well. Really ask yourself, what is the problem? So many people yesterday mentioned that disinformation precedes AI, but AI is one way to think through and address this. And the other thing I would say is think really carefully about what happens when this legislation fails or when it's constitutionally challenged. So a lot of people mentioned Section 230 yesterday. Well, one reason why we have Section 230 is because the Communications Decency Act was challenged successfully, and it tried to regulate indecent content on the internet, right? Every piece of that legislation failed, but Section 230 remained, right? So try to think through what do these failures put in place.
Chris Vinay wants to have final thoughts on this. Rackley, on what would you say to AI policymakers, policymakers designing AI regulation today?
Well, perhaps there's many things that we could say. Perhaps I'll just choose to focus on the need for flexibility and agility as we regulate AI to make sure that we find a right balance between not stifling innovation and ensuring that our rights, our dignity, our freedoms are well protected. It's no country has gotten it right so far in our experience, as we're working with over 60 countries on implementing the recommendation. It's a journey. It's a modular approach to AI governance, about building the AI governance block by block. And we at UNESCO, we're at the front lines of this policy innovation on AI governance, and we're really excited about gathering that information, consolidating it, and making it available to policymakers and the companies for their use. And that probably one of the best examples is the disclosure initiative that we're developing together with TRF.
Excellent. In the final few minutes we have, I just would quickly like to hear from each of you about what, looking ahead, you see as the most significant challenges we might expect next when it comes to trustworthy AI adoption by corporate practices. I don't know if, Diana, you want to start us off with what's keeping you up at night.
I already mentioned this, but out there, many technologies, some in the shape of AI, are going to be used to do bad things. So we really, on this side, the ones that want to be responsible, that wants to hold ethics, we need to move fast, and we need to start implementing this as soon as possible.
Andrew.
I would say speed. This world is changing really quick, but speed on shared values and principles rather than trying to set up global brands against each other.
Wendy.
I would say inequalities in the ways in which if you train a system on the past and consider something to be generative if the result is plausible, then what you do is embed past mistakes and train them into the future. So what kind of world and change can we have working with these systems to help us diagnose what was wrong rather than automatically implement those mistakes and make it our future?
Rackle, I'll give you the final word. I appreciate that this probably would be a great time to have some of that data from this disclosure tool available, but curious, sort of what's your hypothesis of the next challenge ahead?
Achieving the truly inclusive nature of the development of AI. It's one thing that to talk about it and the need to engage all the sectors and all the layers of the society, but when really push comes to shove, it's it takes some thinking about how to meaningfully capture the voices of those that are not usually part of these conversations, and that's what we'll be really focusing on at UNESCO.
Amazing.
Moving forward.
I want to say a final thank you to all of our panelists. I think we've had a quite intense conversation here about the different mechanisms, the different approaches, the considerations for trustworthy AI and corporate practice and what we might see in the years ahead. So one final round of applause, please, for our panelists. Thank you.